All right, so welcome everybody. We're all here today for Ron Verzuh's book, Smelter Wars. He's going to tell us a little bit about it. But before we get going any further, I believe we're going to have Rosa Jordan up here to do a little intro for Ron. So Rosa, come on up for me.
Hello, yes, I read the history of Rossland. I've been living in Rossland about 40 years. Ron has been here much longer because he comes from the trail. So he is our true native son, and he did a video of the Miners' Hall, which relates to Joe Hill's passage through there during the labor strike, and more recently, of course, Smelter Wars, which I hope you will get to read soon. And he's been working on local labor history for a very long time. I don't think there are too many people around who are better informed than he is on this stuff.
Thank you.
So let's hear it.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Skyler, for that introduction to the event. Rosa's actually figures more prominently in Smelter Wars than she knows. There was a book out, I don't know, mid-90s, I guess. It's called Red Bait. And one of the characters I'm going to tell you about tonight was the author of that memoir. And at the back of that memoir is an excellent essay on the Rossland Miners Union and Sheila. And I tapped into it for all sorts of reasons, including making a film. So we go back a ways, and that's great. I also want to thank the museum generally and you workers here, because without museums and public libraries, well, I would be nowhere, because as a writer and historian, I spend a lot of time there. I'm not a member of the Museum Society in Victoria yet, but I intend to be one. However, last week I did join the Greater Victoria Public Library Board, Friends of the Board. So I'm pretty keen on you folks, so carry on, you can let me just tell you, I'm going to read a little teeny excerpt from this book, very short. And then what I'm going to do is tell you a story. I'm not going to sit here like an academic and tell you what the footnotes are. Oh, there are plenty of footnotes in this book. Because I wanted to make sure that if anybody wanted to track down my trail, they could go and find it. And so even the newspaper clippings are labeled, and even the title of the newspaper clipping is labeled date, age. So if you want to find out what I found out, you can go right to the source. I think that's what historians should do, is give readers a chance to go and do the research for themselves if they want. And that's what I've tried to do here in this book. But yeah, let me start with this little teeny quote, and then I'll tell you the story. Sound good? The story's fun, right? All right. I'll tell you who the quote is from in a minute. This is the epigram of the book. While the acts of kings and governments provide the great brushstrokes on the canvas of human experience, it is the strivings and aspirations of ordinary people and day-to-day events that complete the picture and give it meaning. A careful reading of the history of the Kootenay district clearly demonstrates this fact. In the lives of the early fur traders, miners, lumbermen, we find thought and action, which has left its imprint upon our times. This is a quote in June of 1954 in Local 480, the book is about Local 480, Local 480's commentator, and it was by H.W. Burt Harridge. Burt was writing a column in the paper called Jottings from Ottawa, because he was our MP for Kootenay West for many, many years. In fact, I don't think he was retired there in 1972. He was there from 1945. First with the Commonwealth Federation, and then with the NDP. So I thought that was a pretty appropriate quote, and I've sort of wrapped up how I feel about why we should keep doing history. Now, I think people make our history. I think we make our own history in the process. And that's what Burt was basically saying is, we often get discarded because a king or a queen gets to write the history because they were the victor. Right? But this is a different story. These guys get to write this history, and they're part of us, and part of our community. So I had a great pleasure being able to do that. And I think you'll see why when I tell you the story. What I've been doing in the last 4 or 5 presentations is I'm actually starting with the cast of characters. And so I'm going to run you through the book, I'm not going to read the book to you because then you would buy the book, so that's not good for me. But I'm going to run you through a chronological order of characters that populate the book, that show up in the pages of it. And I'll probably miss some things, but I'm going to give you the best I can. The first character is a guy named Arthur Slim Evans. I don't know, some of you have heard of him for sure, right? No? Yes? You have. So Arthur Slim Evans is the guy who starts the drive to organize the 5,000 workers at the smelter. Big job. He comes into town in fall of 1938, so he was in that area. And he comes in with some interesting credentials. He, quite early on, he's involved in a very early labor dispute, which becomes a horrendous evil dispute in Colorado. He's down there, and a bunch of miners have been on strike at a big mine that's owned by a man named John D. Rockefeller, a famous millionaire. And the strike's getting out of hand. And in fact, they're losing the strike. The employer is losing the strike. So Rockefeller basically somehow works with the governor, and they bring in the National Guard, and they kill 11 people, women and children, that are in a tent camp. And that becomes known as the Leavenworth Massacre. The dates are back from, I think, 1912, 1913, something like that. Slim's there, and he gets caught up in the crossfire, and his machine gun. He gets a leg shot. He lives ever since then. He lives in Detroit. in his little vehicle, which has been provided by a new organization called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. The CIO has basically hired Slim, along with a lot of people like Slim, to try and organize industrial workers all over North America. And he brings a few other credentials which are interesting for us. For example, in 1935, he leads what is now known as the On to Ottawa March, trek march. And this is a trek of, it starts out with about 1,000 or more people who jump on a train in Vancouver, and they're heading for Ottawa. They're going to confront R.B. Bennett, the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada. And they're going to say, we are doing a crappy job of helping these relief workers in the heart of the depths of the Depression. So we need more money for them, and we need to help them. So they get to Regina, and the whole thing is stopped. And Slim goes on. He meets R.B. Bennett, and he's a pretty good shoot for the left guy, and he does exactly that with the Prime Minister. So he becomes a bit of a hero. He comes back, and shortly thereafter, it's another story. They have something called the Regina Riot. And I'm not going to go into that now, but Slim walks through that. He gets back. He's hired on. And then the second thing is kind of interesting because he comes up here about 37. And if you know your history, he's up here and he's visiting Salmo and other communities, and he's raising money. And what he's raising money for is to help a group called the MacPaps. The MacPaps are the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, and they're part of the international group that is fighting fascism in Spain as the Spanish War unfolds, leading into the Second World War. So he comes in, people know who he is. The last credential was an interesting one because he has been a communist since 1926, and quite a vocal one. So he's there, he's in jail, and it's late 1938, and he's facing another character in the book. This is a different kind of character. This is a guy you might have heard about. His name is Selwyn Golden Blaylock. And I don't know, anybody heard about him? Do most of us know about him? Because I find there's not that much knowledge about Blaylock. In fact, if you leave town, you probably won't hear his name for another 5,000 miles because he's just not, this is his town. He was the king of trail. And Rossland too, because all the mines fed into the smelter. Right? Anyway, Blaylock doesn't want the union. And Slim is in town to raise interest in the union. He's making speeches. He's going on CJAT radio. He's talking to people. He's in the bars. He liked to be in the bars, his daughter tells me. And, just kibitz a bit with workers and kind of get things moving. But Blaylock is sort of kind of mustering his forces. He has an ally. Well, he has a lot of allies, but the one major ally he has is the Trail Daily Times, which is now the Trail Twice a Week Times, right? And it has a long history of 120 years as well, but they are kind of considered, at least by the union, as a company mouthpiece. And Blaylock, everything Blaylock does gets reported, I can guarantee you that. But we've got a whole bunch of kind of social agitation going on here. We've got the end of the Depression. We've got people still trying to deal with that. There's enough knowledge now that they know we're moving into a war, and people will be enlisted to fight in the war. So this is kind of a maelstrom of really tight organizing going on at the same time as the social structure is getting challenged, and there's really some trouble afoot. And so Slim doesn't get too far because he's a little bit of a drinker, and he gets drunk and he smashes his car into another car. He's had a lot of trouble with people, and they've done some hard things to Slim, but the courts don't favor him, and he defends himself very badly, and he has to leave town. Another guy comes up, he's a machinist up the hill. He's a guy named John McPeak, and he carries on a little bit of what Slim did, but he's nowhere near the charismatic speaker and guy. Slim, you're gonna pay attention, right? And so he does a pretty good job, but he can't hold it together. And he leaves. He goes up north to the Northwest Territories, and in the meantime, there isn't much going on. This is 1939. We're moving into the war, and maybe 100 members have signed up of the 5,000 workers. A year and a half of work. Pretty good guy like Slim pushing the buttons, but they're not joining. Well, we wait, and we happen to have a new law. BC government passes a law. Oh, I have to tell you one preface to that. Blaylock is a smart guy, and he's beat the earlier union at a strike in 1917. But now, after that, he got smart and he created something we now call a company union. This is a union that the company funds, and they give you all the room to meet and talk to people, and full carte blanche sort of privileges on the hill. And their loyalty to Blaylock is fierce. They see him as the papa, and he thinks of them as his big one happy family. So this company union lasts from about 1918 to when the law changes in 1943, and it says you can't have a company union anymore. They're not legal. So score one for Local 480 of the International Union of Mine Mill and Smelter Wars. That impediment has been removed. The guys that are part of that company would start another union. And they jokingly call it the Maple Leaf Union, but it's another union which is basically putting up a barrier, and Blaylock's behind that one too. Well, a year passes, and in I guess it's around maybe it's 43 as well, maybe 44, January, I think it is. The federal government passes another law. It's kind of a weird little law. It's called PC 1003. And it's basically the Mackenzie Keene government passing a Privy Council order that allows unions to organize, and it allows them to do all the things unions can do, including strike. Well, that's the second score for the union. Now they've got it. They can go ahead. People should be a lot more comfortable signing a card and joining the organization. So they start to gather steam, and more people start to work at it. In the meantime, a third character comes along. We've got a guy named Harvey Murphy entering the scene. Harvey's an interesting guy. He was born in Poland. He's a Polish Jew. He comes to Toronto. He abandons his own family, and eventually works his way west, but not before he's caught by the police. And don't forget, this war years. And the police interrogate him for a month in Toronto, and then they actually basically sentence him to an internment camp in Hull, Quebec, where he is for 13 or 14 months. When he gets out, he heads west. He gets a job with Mine Mill, and they send him directly to Trail. So this is an interesting guy. Slim Evans was the charismatic character. Harvey Murphy was the coup de grace, really, because he could speak his way through anything, and he did. And when they hit the spring of '44, they were in negotiations with Blaylock. In 1944, in about, I guess it was June or July, they finally cracked the big fish because they got a contract. It's a flimsy little thing, 1 page long, but they get a contract that says you are the union that represents these 5,000 workers on the hill. A big score, right, when you think about it. I mean, how many people organize 5,000 anything, right? I mean, most of us now can't figure out how to have lunch together. There they were, and they were in agreement, and not all of them, because there was still this other fight going on with the company union, but enough of them that they were able to be certified as the legitimate bargaining union of those workers. And Blaylock sat in his office and said hello, turned his face to the window and said, okay, you're the union. I don't have to like you. Sign the paper, get out of my office, right? And I don't want to portray it too much as the real bad guy, because I think Blaylock was important to Trail. It was important to the region. Really, I mean, he pushed a lot of buttons. And he did some things that I didn't like. There were some things I thought were pretty good for people, particularly the Italian immigrants that came here. And there were a lot of them working at Cominco at the time. And you can still see, you can hear all sorts of Italian names here or in Rossland that are the families of people that came here back in the 1900s, early 1900s. Anyway, that fall, the following year, they had this contract and they were getting ready to negotiate a new one, a more formal contract. But in November, on the 19th of November, Blaylock died. At 66 years old, he had spent 40 years with the company, and he built the company up into a massive world-class lead and zinc smelter. Plus inventing this fertilizer plant, right, which is a whole other story I cover in the book, how that happened. So from then on, Murphy sticks around. He comes out of Vancouver. I remember my dad saying, Harvey Murphy lives out of a suitcase. He's never home. And I bet you his wife Isabel would agree with that. Anyway, he's got a whole number of people that are kind of part of his communist club, right? And in fact, the very first president of Local 480, and a lot of those guys don't know this, was a guy named Gar Belanger. And Gar was a real dynamite go-getter, and he was the kind of guy who would stick up for workers, and he did. And at one point, Blaylock fired him. So he became a little bit of a bad guy hero kind of thing. Interestingly, during those war years I was talking about, Blaylock did one thing that was interesting. He hired many women. In July of 1942, he started hiring women to replace the enlisted workers who'd gone overseas. And they took on non-traditional work in the smelter. And the book talks about that in the whole chapter because it was so important, it seems to me, to not overlook this. You know, I mean, this is something that people probably know a little bit about, but that sort of had the potential, in my view, to change women's equality and advance it in whole different ways. In spite of being paid only 80% of the salary the men were getting, they were doing the job the men did, and in fact, there was some testimony that they were doing it well or even better. So they fought to, work with the local union, local one, and then they created what they called a women's auxiliary. I think they called it a ladies' auxiliary then, but it was Local 131 of the women's auxiliary. There was one up here too. And they were really behind the locals' organizing drive, but they were very independent. They weren't prepared to say, "Oh, the president of the local union is going to tell us what to do, and we're just going to be in the kitchen there making soup." They didn't go for that. This was not on for them, and their own constitution said no. And they had their own newsletter. So they were a really dynamic group of people, and one of the most dynamic people at all was Tilly Belanger. Tilly Belanger was, again, her and her husband were both communists, but they very dynamic individuals. Tilly was a nurse, and they actually were the ones who politicized the Local 131 of the ladies' auxiliary. And they did things like go on radio to support the local and themselves. They went on to write leaflets and leaflet plant gates when things went badly there to help workers who were being badly treated. And wrote articles for the international union papers, and they were a really active force. One of them actually won an award at the International Union for her essay on why I support mine mill. So that is all happening, that dynamic is going on as we roll along. 1946 comes And 1946 is a big year for strikes. A lot of strikes going on, particularly in the U.S. Extractive industries like mining and processing industries like smelting are on strike, and thousands of workers are out on strike. In this province, lots of workers are out in the other mine mill locals, but not local 480 and trail. Not because they wouldn't have gone on a strike, but because Murphy done such a good job. They had been getting good contracts, and they couldn't go out when they already had a good contract. They'd already signed on. So they supported the other unions as they went on strike and tried to get better deals for themselves post-war, because a lot of suffering had gone on, right? Even the trail, which had jobs for the most part, they weren't doing that well. I mean, there were all sorts of rationing systems, and meatless Tuesdays, and beerless Fridays, and on and on and on. Right? So that period of time lasted for about a year and a half. And then in 1947, some interesting things happened. In the U.S., there's a law that's passed. It's actually the kind of rewrite of an important law in 1935 called the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act is the labor law that takes place during the Roosevelt era, which is a bit more of a progressive era. And the act that's passed, I think mostly written by employers, undoes a lot of the Wagner Act. It's called the Taft-Hartley Act. And it basically also starts to undo some of the organizing that's been done, or the organizers who've taken on this CIO I told you about. Because it says, we need you to sign an affidavit that you're not a communist. If you don't sign that, we're going to ostracize you. We're going to kick you out of the movement. We're going to kick you out of the leadership of the movement. And of course, Local 480 has a whole bunch of guys who are communists. Now, they're not getting asked to sign any affidavits, but there's an overlap, right? People hear that. In this particular part of the world, there's a lot of overlap of U.S. crossing the border, and lots of Americans moved up here during the mining area. And so Murphy is a communist, and so is another character that I have to introduce, a guy named Al King. And the King family here is quite well known. You might have heard of Bill King. He was the labor minister here during the Barrett government and the NDP government in the early 70s. And he died a couple of years ago, but he lived in Fruitvale for years. Anyway, Al was the communist brother. And little known to some folks, his sister Olive was Harvey Murphy's secretary, and she was also a communist. So these are hard-fighting people. I remember talking to Bill, and he said, my brother and sister believed what they were doing, and they would fight tooth and nail to uphold what they thought was the right thing for society. And he respected that, but he was an NDPer, so he went to the social democratic side of things on an ideological plane. Right? Anyway, King's there, Murphy's there, it's 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act is in, and another character comes along. I won't populate it too much, but another character comes along. His name is Claire Billingsley. And Claire Billingsley was hired by Harvey Murphy as an organizer for mine mill in the region. And he did do some organizing, organized some workplaces in different mining areas, and he lived in trail, and he had worked in trail, and he'd done some interesting work around health and safety for trail as well, particularly the medical plan that was being developed at that time. Anyway, Billingsley decides that he doesn't like the local, and he doesn't like the people who are running the local, and he doesn't like their politics. So he runs for president in 1947. And he wins. He becomes president of the local, and his first steps are to start to undermine the local and tear it apart. Because he feels that it's a communist-led local, and it can't be good, and he's an anti-communist, and this has got to go. Well, that goes on in his battles all across the board for a year. And then he does something interesting that changes things for Local 480. He engages with another big union. And this is probably one of the biggest unions of the time in the U.S. It's the Steelworkers, United Steelworkers of America. There are 1 million members. And Little Mine Mill is 100,000 members all over the place, right? And they're dropping fast. Anyway, the Steelworker guys roll in, and they collaborate with Claire Billingsley to actually just decimate the local union, the Local 480, the legitimate local union, and they fought for 6 years to get that legitimacy. They're being torn apart. Al King tries to run against him, and he loses. buildings he wins again, and he carries on this decimation of the law. Harvey Murphy as good an orator as he is, does something really stupid at this point. 1948, he gets drunk at a big conference of labor leaders, and he starts to say all sorts of disparaging things and nasty things about the other labor leaders. I won't go into the details of why, but that gets him suspended from the BC Federation of Labor, which is the big labor central in the province. And they say, you're no longer vice president, you're out 2 years on the rocks. And so Harvey doesn't stop working, but he can't do very much now because he's lost this position at the provincial level. King comes back. He runs again in the early 50s. Meanwhile, the rest of the movement's got rid of Harvey, and they're on a roll. They're going to purge everybody. It's known in vernacular as the Red Labor Purges. And they get rid of a lot of communists, and a lot of former communists come forward to help them do it. So this is a battle that we don't know much about here, but that was all just percolating for several years. And King comes back and runs, I think it's 1950, and he beats Billingsley, and he becomes the local president. And he then sets about trying to reorganize the union and try to build some kind of financial war chest so they have something to work with. And Murphy comes back into the play, right? And if you read the book Red Bait that we were mentioning that Rose's piece is in, there's all sorts of bad things that Al King says about Harvey Murphy, but there are also sort of some very respectful things about Harvey Murphy. So he wins the presidency. He starts to reorganize, and the steelworkers orchestrate what's known as a raid. That's when another union comes in and takes the members of a union that's already established in place and tries to abscond with them and bring them into their union. It's not really, I'm not even sure what its legal status is, but it happens a lot of the time in the union movement. Anyway, that becomes a war. That's one of the many smelter wars you'll read about. Because they have to then fight to save their union, and this million-member union is rolling in there, and they got all the money in the world. And they start publishing full-page ads in the Trail Daily Times, which the Trail Daily Times is happy to publish because it's more money in their pockets, right? Then My Mill has to put ads in, and so there's a war going on, kind of a war of words, I guess, or a war of ads. And little by little, it comes down to a vote. And in the end, I think it's about 53, the Labor Board holds the vote, and the workers of Trail decide that they will stay with Local 480 as a mine mill local. And Steel threatens to continue to raid, but they leave town. They leave their office intact for a while downtown, but they pretty much leave town. Now, so how do you regain your public's presence a little bit when you've gone through these wars and you've had sides and men and women fighting each other, families battling, women writing to the smelter, women writing to the paper, smelter men writing back. And so it's kind of the community's kind of in upheaval, really. So Murphy decides that we need to do something for our public image. We need to do something to let people know they've got the right union. He's got a buddy, another character in the book. His name is Paul Robeson. Now, anybody who knows about opera or music or has ever seen the movie Showboat or heard the song Old Man's River will know who Paul Robeson is. But he was something else as well. Paul Robeson in the early 50s, actually it was probably, I'd say 52 maybe, the State Department in Washington, D.C. took away his passport. They said, you're not leaving the country now. You've been a bad boy. You've been saying nasty things about President Harry S. Truman, and you went to the Soviet Union, and therefore you're out of town, man. You're not going to leave this place. Well, Harvey Murphy said, we're going to call him, and we're going to bring him up to our conference in Vancouver at the old Denman Auditorium. 2,500 workers meeting up there, trade unionists. So when they found out that they went down to get him at Blaine, the border, no go. He was with a lawyer from San Francisco, and they were sent back. So they went back to Seattle. Harvey Murphy talked to them, and they set up a phone line at the Marine Workers Union, where Robeson was actually a member. And they set up a microphone, and they hooked up the phone lines to the Denman Auditorium in downtown Vancouver. and they broadcast Paul Robeson singing songs to the convention for 15 minutes and brought the house down. Because they all knew the story at that point, right? And then Murphy proceeded to get resolutions on the floor and pass nasty resolutions about the State Department and everybody else. And he vowed that they would have 4 concerts at the border, at Blaine, for the next 4 years. And the first one that they had, the Peace Arch was the Peace Arch concert in 1952 or 53, I forget exactly. I think it was 52. And they brought out 40,000 people and the Peace Arch had been down there, and they filled that whole area. And Robeson stood up in the back of a flatbed truck and sang to the audience for about an hour and a half. Murphy introduced him, which is interesting, and Al King was on the podium with him. So it's kind of interesting that they're trying to use this cultural device, to move forward. By the way, Robeson was never proved to be a communist. People kept calling him that, but there was no evidence that he ever joined the Communist Party. But he was sympathetic with some of the communist views that he knew about. And the other thing that's interesting, and I'm kind of coming to the end of the story here because I stopped it in the book in 1955, is that, and I think this is fascinating, there was a movie that came out in 1954, and the movie was called Salt of the Earth. It was a banned movie. It was about a strike at a zinc mill, or a zinc mine in New Mexico, down on the south end of New Mexico. And it was mostly Mexican-American workers and their families. They lived in this little town, and this big zinc corporation was not behaving well, and they went on strike. And these guys making the movie were part of something called the Hollywood 10, and this was people who were shunned by Hollywood for being communists. And one of them actually came from Grand Forks. My dad went to school with a guy named Edward Dimitri. He went on to win prizes and so forth. They were brought up against this House Un-American Activities Committee, and they were basically told, you're not going to work anymore here. A lot of them left the country. But they made, a few of them stayed on, and they made this film. Fascinating, too, a process, because they had an Oscar award-winning writer. And he went in and thought he could write a script about this strike and the things that happened within this community. And he came back and said, I can't write the script, they have to write the script. And they have to act in the movie. So they made a movie called Salt of the Earth, where it starred the people who were actually in the strike. And one of the really neat things about that whole thing was it was the women who won the strike. It was women who were at home who found that the workers in the mine were actually told you can't go on strike, you can't picket the plant, you have to get out or we'll put you in jail. So all the women who were in the community said, no, we're going to go to a meeting with the men, we're going to say, we're doing it. You guys can't do it, you can't win this strike unless we go out there and do something. So they did. And then they went to jail, took the babies with them. The men went home and washed the diapers and hung out the washing and so forth. And this is all in this film. It's a marvelous show about the strength of women when they really see a cause and they embrace it. And they showed this. Well, of course, Mine Mill was the sponsor of the movie. And Mine Mill was already, as I told you, labeled as a communist bad guy. So the movie got labeled as a communist plot, right? So I encourage you to see it. And I'll finish by telling you how I got people out here to see it not too long ago. So they win the strike, and the movie's made, and it comes out in '54, but they can't find any place to show it because it's a banned movie. And there are congressmen barking about it and saying it's horrible, and it's a plot, and it's this and it's that. Even one of the unions, the projectionist union in the States, has banned it. They're a union. So, come back to Trail, 1954. Local 480 says, we're going to show the film. So they get a hold of 2 theaters in Trail, the 2 theaters there, and they contact it, and the theater says, sure, we'll do it. And then they call their owners in Vancouver, and their owners in Vancouver say, no, you're not. That's a banned film, you're not going to show it in theaters. So they trundle off to the Castle Theatre, and they agree that you can show it 5 times. Right? And they do. They go out, they charge 25 cents a pop, up and 15 cents for kids, and they regale the audience with this wonderful story of success of ordinary workers, taking on a big giant and winning. And I don't think it's not so romanticized as I'm making it, because it was a hard job, and they showed how hard it was. But you do feel the spirit of it, and I can tell you, I know that because a couple of things happened. One, secretary named E.B. Knobs at the local 480 at that time in the early 50s was also a poet. She went to the first episode, the first film showing, and she wrote a poem about it, and I put that in the book. I think you find it quite inspiring. So we're at this point where just before they show it, a woman named Anita Torres comes up she's been on the strike. Her and Lorenzo, her husband, have been on strike. And she comes up to tell the story to the ladies, the Women's Auxiliary 131. And they're thrilled, and they treat her royally. In fact, they're so happy with her, and it's the middle of January, so they give her a Hudson's Bay blanket. Okay? Pretty good for someone from New Mexico who's never seen snow before. Very appreciative. The guys at 480 are also kind and considerate, and they took her to a hockey game. Smoke eaters probably. And Anita was a little surprised because she thought hockey was played on horses, but she found out differently. So she was intrigued, and she stayed around for a few days. Then it was because of her, I think, partly that they actually got the spirit to get this film showing, right? Because she was quite forceful in her presentation. So those two events were kind of cultural events that tried to show the community what the local 480 and the union were about. And I don't know how much they succeeded. I talk about it in the book, but I think it was partly an idea, kind of not propaganda, but a PR show in a way. But it also was a historical thing, and they did a wonderful thing with it. And I wanted to tell you that the book's also filled with stories like that. It's not just a story about guys organizing union and bargaining contracts. There's very little of that. It's mostly about how people lived at the time, things that they did, movies that they saw, people who came to town who were famous. Duke Ellington was there. Guy Lombardo and his Canadians were there, and dozens of other people came to town because it was trail in Rossland, a big deal in those days. And in fact, up until very shortly, Rossland was the bigger town. Anyway, that kind of thing is peppered throughout the book, and you're learning what people ate and where they could get a bite of food. Bluebird Cafe here, and the Chinese restaurant there. And you learned about the ethnic groups that were in the area. So you learned about who was from where and how they were treated. And there's a whole chapter there on immigrant workers that came to this area and how they were treated. So in the end, it was kind of a special moment in the area, for me anyway, in the history of the area. By 1955, where I end the book, Harvey Murphy and Al King are still working together, but that year, at the old hall down here, they hold a big Canadian convention of the locals. And they decide that, and they've actually softened this up at the international level in Colorado, but they decide we need a Canadian mine mill. We need all the locals in Canada to become one union under this one umbrella. And that's just done down here at the Union Hall. There's pictures of it. So I think I got a picture in the book of it. But at that point, Murphy's time doesn't end here. Al King's time doesn't end here. He carries on. But they've beaten steel. The steel workers leave town. It's ironic because they're here again now, but they leave town and they keep fighting and raiding in other unions across the continent. And Local 480 and other unions like it fight them all the way to the wire. And they win most of them. My mill wins most of those big struggles with steel. But Murphy's going to leave town. He got a job. He becomes vice president of this new Canadian Mine Mill Union, and he becomes editor of the Herald, the Mine Mill Herald, out of Toronto, I think, at that point. And Al King and Murphy eventually get jobs when the unions merge in 1967. And so you have today, Local 480, But that's the history of how he got there. And now it's a steelworker local, and they're bargaining today. I just met the guys at a beer parlor, and they're in bargaining, and they're hopeful that they'll get a good deal today. But it isn't the same union, but I hope they'll read their own union story. And so I passed them a few copies of the book. But that's basically what the book's about. And I hope you will read it and enjoy it. And if you have questions, send me an email. If you find any errors, don't talk to me. But yeah, that's about it. I wonder if you just open it up if you have any thoughts or questions. And I've given you a pretty rough book, okay? So there's probably some errors of date here and there, but the issues are generally what I depicted for you. Silence.
I definitely have a question.
I do.
Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
I was wondering how a Polish Jew becomes Murphy.
What was that again?
I'm wondering how Harvey Murphy, if he's a Polish Jew, how does he get that name?
Oh, good
Was that
question.
something
Good
when,
question.
when
Okay.
he emigrated, he changed his name?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And it's one I can answer fairly well, I think. When Murphy comes to Canada, he's 13 years old. His mother brings him to Canada. I'm not even sure he speaks English, but his dad, Abraham, has been there for several years. And each time he returned to Poland, they came back with another kid. But they finally move here, and Harvey has a very big dispute with his dad. His dad's an Orthodox Jew, and Harvey's a communist. Harvey's an atheist. So he has to leave home really early. And Harvey gets in trouble pretty early. In fact, by 1928, he's a young man still. The police, RCMP, have already got a profile on him, which means he's a watched person. Their surveillance is always on him. And they do that all his life, right till he dies. But he figures this way. Murphy's the name of a lot of Irish police officers, you know. So if I'm Murphy, if I say I'm Chernikovsky, they're probably not going to leave me alone. But maybe I get a little sympathy if I call myself Murphy. So that's the story I know. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. Yeah, he was a character. He was a real character. And all of those people that I mentioned had their own personalities. You know, it was fun. It was fun to read about it, fun to learn about it. Yeah. Scott?
I was actually just going to ask, with all your research and stuff that you did on the labor movement early on, if you could speak to the importance of that movement to the foundation of the CCF and its growth.
Interesting. There's a whole chapter, I call it, I think I call it the ideology of the West Kootenay or something like that, on the CCF, which started in 1932, and the Communist Party, which was pretty active at that point, and they were still legal until the war started, and they had to change their name basically. But their fights went on endlessly because the Stalinists, if you will, were in a period of time where they were advising their followers to criticize the CCF as social fascists. That was the term. And the idea was to try and undermine the CCF because it was threatening to take over some of the workplaces and get those workers into unions like steel, for example. But that fight went on a long time. If you remember the opening quote I read to you, it's by a guy named Bert Harridge. Bert ran into a real snag in 1945. Local 40 was supporting him in the election, but the CCF wasn't. So he created something called the People's CCF. And he ran, and with support from Local 480 and many others here, he won. And the CCF big shots in Vancouver were not happy. Because they had actually found someone, I think in Caslow, to come in and run against him. And he didn't even get his deposit back for running against him because nobody knew him. And they knew Bert, you know, because Bert had been standing up for all these workers' rights issues at that time, among other things. So that became a real ideological fight, another Smelter War, really, because they never did come to terms. You know, there were attempts by some of the communists to kind of show that they were collaborating with the CCF, but the CCF didn't want that. If you remember your CCF NDP history, David Lewis was a steelworker lawyer, And he became the leader of the party, right, in the 70s, corporate welfare bond period. And he was adamantly against any kind of collaboration with communists. He wasn't the only one, but I mean, he was a vocal, lawyer, right? So that battle went on, and it stayed on for a long time. And as you know, the CCF, its main document was something called the Regina Manifesto, and it actually had some pretty serious socialist commentary in there. Nationalize the railroads, nationalize the banks. Do what socialists do, right? Yeah. By 1956, a year after the mine mill, Canadian mine mill started, they had a Winnipeg conference, and they started to soften up the socialist side of the NDP, in the view of some scholars anyway. Yeah. I don't know what the Lewises would say, but that's the recording from some of them. And history is history, right? And we go on. Anybody else? Not hearing a peep from anybody. What's the scared of it, Scott?
Must have, either that or you were just like so thorough.
So dynamic.
Everyone's questions were just answered. You were just ahead of it.
That's it. Well, I want to thank you. I hope you buy the book. I think you'll find it as exciting as I did to write it. And that you will comment on it if you get a chance.
It seems like the more things change, the more they're the same. And when I think of this in context to today's world, or what I'm assuming I'm going to read, being from the U.S.,
kind of a different smoke there, right? Yeah. Because the number of people that are organized in industry in the U.S. is, I think, below 10%. I think the level of organization in Canada and in BC is quite a bit higher than that. But yeah, I wanted to say something to you, because I sort of haven't ended this in the book, because I wrote it a while ago. There are some amazing things happening right now in the organizing field, and you've all read about them. Amazon, the whole effort to organize warehouse workers there. In fact, I had an Amazon manager in the group this morning. And he's all for the union because he's been injured and he's had so many hard things to do with workers and try to get them to do things the company wanted to do. And another group is Starbucks. And these are young people who are actually, it seems they're willing to go out there on their own. They're not really asking a big union like steelworkers or the United Food and Commercial Workers. They're actually saying, no, we're going to do this right now in this community. And we're going to get the vote here. And so a lot of what's happened between the time we talk about in the book and now is that unions have become pretty big and they have become pretty structured. So that, when somebody wants to form a union, it's often, let's call this guy in Toronto or Vancouver or Ottawa. And, it's a bit of a fly in the support kind of an effort, or parachute in someone who will organize the union for us. These guys aren't saying that anymore. They're saying, we're going to do this ourselves. No, they may need support at some point, and I don't know whether it'll all fold up, but I'm pretty impressed that they would have the same spirit that I write about in this book, to say, we're going to down tools if we have to, if you do something we don't like. And damn it, they're doing that, and they're making headlines to do it.
We'll have to do it.
I mean, and in the States, they're going to get hammered, right? I mean, Fox News is going to be on their tail every day, but they're gutsy, and they're young enough to really powerfully move ahead. So I'm still thinking we've got some things to learn from the stuff I wrote about. And one of it is, just to let me leave you with this thought, unions are part of the community, and you may not like them sometimes. I've got grandchildren who won't join the union because, they don't like them, because they have to pay dues and stuff like that. Right? But they're part of the community, and in many cases, they're helping make the community thrive. The workers that are, 1,500 or 1,600 workers that are down that smelter today, down from 5,000, actually 5,600 was the high. They're there and they're making good salaries and having good pensions because there was a lot of fighting going on in the 40s and 50s. And I think the society is better. The company gave the community a lot, and Blaylock gave the community a lot, hospitals and housing, but you don't have, giving things away doesn't make you a community. Helping build it yourself is what makes the community. So I think there's some promise there. Lots of my friends say you're full of crap because everything's falling apart in a handcart, right? But we've got a rough period of time we're going through here. We just came through 2 years of horror, and now we got this damn war. And it's influencing everything we do. And not just gas prices. People can't find stuff on food shelves in our country. So, we're in a tough period, and I think we're resilient. And I'm really proud to say we're part of that. We gotta fight though. I think we gotta fight guys like Trump all along the way. And many people in the States are pretty miserable right now.
Yes, they are.
But that's another topic for another item. But hey, thanks for coming up all this week. Say hello to Lewiston. So that's it, I gotta get going. Oh no, we're gonna show a movie.
Exactly. So
Rose is in this one. Rose is in this movie.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night in the Miners Union Hall. Says I, but Joe, you're shot and gone. Says he, I'll never fall. Says he, I'll never fall. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you.
Rossland, British Columbia, an old gold mining camp turned popular ski resort today. Rossland has a long history full of get-rich-quick intrigue and tales of the local mine workers' struggles for rights and social justice. Part of that history is hidden in the historic Rossland Miners Union Hall, where persistent rumors suggest that Joe Hill, the famous wobbly protest singer, spoke and sang. Built in 1898, it provided support for striking local miners in 1901 and became a meeting place for union activists as well as a venue for union events and activities. Hill was often seen on the picket lines of his union, the Industrial Workers of the World. Sometime in 1911 or 1912, he picketed with striking wobblies in the Fraser Canyon. There he penned his song, Where the Fraser River Flows. There is a local belief that he could have wandered farther east to Rossland, seeking a hideout from the pursuing authorities, who were never far behind the radical singer-songwriter.
What I do know is that when I first came to Rossland, there were old-timers who had been children who were of union families who said their fathers had seen him here, seen him play at meetings, at union meetings in the Miners' Hall, and that the Pinkertons did come after him here, and that they had helped hide him in secret rooms.
There's talk that he was here and was a speaker on a couple of different occasions. I don't know what those events would have been, but also the rumor that later on, when he was sought after by authorities of a whole pile of different natures, he hid out, or he was hidden out in the Rossland Miners Hall and didn't leave there for all the period of time that he was here. Wasn't seen in town, but the rumor was that he was here.
It would have been the first time a wobbly came to town. Big Bill Haywood, arguably the most famous wobbly leader of all, mentions Rossland in his memoirs. A few years after Hill supposedly came to Rossland, Ginger Goodwin, the leader of the 1917 smelter strike in nearby Trail, spoke at the historic hall. Do local citizens share a belief that Hill was actually here? Does the old hall provide them with a continuing sense of Rossland's special place in history?
Well, I think it had a big influence. I think his presence was an influence no matter where he was, and the fact that in this area here there were a lot of things going on at the time, especially with union activism and communism and all kinds of things that were happening through the union movement. That is something that I think has had a real influence as it's gone on in history.
Whether it's a legend or the fact, the reality is that Joe Hill and the union people here were undergoing the same kind of persecution, and they were fighting for the same causes, which made them natural allies. And it seems to me really probable that he would have come to offer them to support, and that they would have regarded him as a hero.
Joe Hill was a musician. In fact, it was one of the most telling pieces of evidence against him was that because song and music is so powerful, and before there was Twitter, and before there was Facebook, there were meetings where people actually talked to each other And there were songs that reminded people and transmitted memories, and that was very dangerous. In fact, the police chief of San Diego sent a note to the Salt Lake City police chief when Joe was arrested, and he said, "You have certainly got the right man. He is definitely an undesirable citizen. He is somewhat of a musician and a writer of songs for the IWW." And you know, that was the telling thing about why they were so nervous of Joe Hill. He could pull people together, and he could do it with song, and then they would remember.
Today, the Rossland Miners Union Hall is not so much a union hall anymore, though its legacy as such is intact. It now serves as a community and cultural center. An annual film festival is held here, among other activities.
Just walking around this hall and looking at what the miners said they wanted built and what they paid to have built with their own money. The bosses didn't build this, the government didn't build it, the miners paid for it out of their own pockets. And they built a hall that is not just an enclosed space to hold meetings. It's a thing that when you walk in, it says, this thing has dignity. It's got presence, it's got continuity, it's got quality, it's intended as a heritage. And they didn't build it for the few miners who were going to be here for a few years. This building was built to stand as part of the community.
I saw Joe Hill last night in Rossland Miners Hall.
There wasn't any solid historical evidence that proved Joe Hill was ever in Rossland. No graffiti scratched on a back wall reading "JH was here." No ghost hiding in the rafters of the 4th floor attic. Still, what does remain is the rumor of his visit, a kind of rural urban legend perhaps, and a fighting spirit that can still inspire young and old alike to stand up for what they believe is right and just. In fact, the legend of Joe Hill's secret Canadian hideout still resonates at the Joe Hill Coffee House once a month, when some of his songs can still be heard bouncing off the big ceiling beams of the Rossland Miners Union Hall.
So next time, friends, they tell you that there's no use saying no. Just point to them, our wobbly friends, and say it just ain't so. And say it just ain't so. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night in the Miners Union Hall. Says I